Russian President Vladimir Putin met with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi in Uzbekistan. Modi publicly criticized the Russian leader over the war in Ukraine, saying, quote, "Today's era is not an era of war." Putin responded.
I know about your position on the conflict in Ukraine, and I know about your concerns. I know that you share these concerns, and we want all of this to end as soon as possible.
All right, that meeting comes one day after Putin sat down with the president of China. Putin admitted President Xi had concerns about the war in Ukraine. And what should we read from these two meetings? Roland Paris, he previously served as a foreign policy advisor to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. He is now the director of the University of Ottawa's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, and he's right here with me in the studio. Roland, good to see you again. Ian Bremmer is president at Eurasia Group. He is in New York. Ian, thanks for joining us again.
My pleasure.
I'd like to start with you, if I could. I mean, you know, Putin acknowledging to China that China has questions and this rebuke of sorts from Modi. What does this tell us about the situation Putin finds himself in?
It's not great. But it's not all that different. Frankly, when Putin initially invaded Ukraine, the international response was incredibly unified from the West, which he certainly did not expect at the time. And while the Chinese were his friends publicly, they also were doing everything possible not to break sanctions because they don't want to be a pariah. Now, I will say that the public statements by Modi at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting were much sharper than we've ever seen before. And the public obeisance by Putin in the opening statements to Xi were much more sheepish than we've seen. But the actual policy positions over the course of the past few months have all been in the same direction, which is this is the single biggest misjudgment made by any major leader since the end of the Cold War. And Putin is the only one that doesn't seem to really recognize it.
Roland Paris, what's your take of this? You combine it with the fact, too, that even Russian television now is not completely unified in the pure propaganda position we saw at the beginning of this.
Yeah, I agree with Ian's assessment. Although I would say that these exchanges, these public exchanges, were a setback for Putin. I'm sure that when he was planning to go to this SCO meeting, that he was hoping to be able to demonstrate that he had strong friends, that he was a global leader. And then in the interim, he suffers this humiliating military setback in Ukraine. And in those clips, he looked like a man who had to explain himself. So yes, China and India are not imposing costs on Russia. They're happy to buy Russian oil and energy at a discount. But Putin is a man who understands symbolism and gestures, and this was not reflecting, I'm sure, the strength that he wanted to project.
Yeah, he's not a man we're used to seeing having to explain himself. But like Ian Bremmer, I want to pick up on the point that Roland Paris just made, that if you look at Russia's energy sales, China and India, they're buying like over half of the seaborne oil, I think, coming out of that country. So like you have this dynamic that played out in public in the last couple of days, but money tells a bit of a different story. What's it say about their priorities?
No, money tells the same story. That it's at a 30% discount. The Russians are not giving away their oil, but I mean, it's a hell of a lot cheaper because they're in such a poor position. The Russians are supplicants here, not the Indians and not the Chinese. And the Indians, by the way, are buying a lot less Russian military equipment than they used to. And that is because they don't want to buy MiGs and Russian helicopters if they don't think they can get spare parts. And while the Russian oil is still Russian oil, they don't have the ability to manufacture anymore. So, I mean, by all accounts, this is a country that is hurling itself headlong into the abyss. Now, it's a dangerous country that has lots of asymmetric military capabilities, and they can be very disruptive, not just to Ukraine, but more broadly. I'll tell you one other thing. I suspect now on the back of this that Putin will not go to the G20 in Indonesia, because it will be embarrassing for him, and he will not be able to line up publicly the developing countries on his side the way that he had hoped that he might before the events of the last several days on the ground in Ukraine.
Roland Paris, what do you think of that? I know Canada and other countries are trying to have them not kicked out of the G20 and not be allowed to go, but I know the Prime Minister said at the G7 that Canada would go regardless because the issues were too important to sit this one out. What do you think this
I'm sure the Prime Minister and our Foreign Minister, Melanie Joly, would be more than happy if Putin were to sit at that conference, and maybe he will, although that itself would be a sign of weakness that Putin would be projecting if he were to decide suddenly that he had to do his hair that night instead of going to the the conference. But I agree that this is accelerating Russia's the trend that was already underway, which was the trend towards Russia becoming the junior partner in the relationship between Russia and China. And China's trying to walk this middle ground where it's maintaining a strategic partnership with a country that also shares an interest in challenging a international system that it sees as dominated by the United States. But China's going to squeeze everything they can out of Russia and avoid incurring costs themselves.
What's your sense? They're losing ground in Ukraine. They're getting criticism now at home over the conduct of the war and how it's going in a way that we haven't seen. I mean, how do you think Vladimir Putin reacts to that changing dynamic?
Well, it was interesting today because he gave a press conference in which he gave two very different messages. One was he hinted that Russia might escalate in Ukraine, and the other was when he was asked what Russia's war aims were, he said to establish complete control over Donbass, which is a much reduced war aim than regime change in Kyiv. So I think he's keeping his options open right now. I'm sure he doesn't want to have to resort to general mobilization, which has a whole bunch of problems associated with it. But at the same time, he can't afford to keep losing. So I would suspect that he's looking in the cupboard and trying to figure out what kinds of tools he has available to staunch the wound.
Ian Bremmer, what's your sense of how Vladimir Putin may respond to what's happening right now?
Well, he has responded by some military strikes on civilian energy and water infrastructure in Ukraine. He's punishing the Ukrainian people, but he does not have a near-term military option that will change the balance of forces on the ground, even if he were to order a limited mobilization, which would be unpopular in Russia. That's why he has resisted that so far. It would take 4 to 6 months minimum to get those troops raised and trained and into the field. So, I mean, really what he can do in the near term is cause more pain and damage to the Europeans. That means shut off all of their energy as winter comes, with the hope that that raises peace movements in Europe to put more pressure on the Ukrainians to get to the negotiating table. I think that's going to be a failed strategy, but that's about the only thing Putin has left. He's been playing with a bad hand for a long time. This is worse than a bad hand. I'd hate to be the person advising Putin right now on what he should be doing going forward, and maybe that's why there are so many people that are inadvertently jumping out of windows.
That is an epidemic in Russia.
He does have an option, and it might be a last-ditch option for him, not talking about a nuclear option that I think is extremely unlikely. But since he said the war aim is to consolidate control over the Donbass, those two territories, right. If Russian forces continue to perform as poorly as they have been performing, he could strategically withdraw to those areas and have much shorter lines of supply and a much more consolidated position to defend. I think he wants to get into a position of a kind of, at the least, of a stable stalemate, so he can find a way to turn off the war and buy himself time to rearm and re-equip his military so he can take, the next round whenever it is, 3 or 4 years from now.
Yeah, I'm old enough to remember in the early days of the war when they thought they were 72 hours from taking Kyiv. Remember the long line of trucks and tanks and everything outside? But Ian Bremmer, you mentioned general mobilization and how unpopular that would be and how reluctant maybe Putin is to do that. We are seeing reports from regional leaders at the lower level calling for a volunteer surge and a mobilization there. Do you think he's trying to get to that through proxies rather than doing it himself, putting it down to subordinates?
The military bloggers have been saying that as well in Russia. They've also been quite critical of whatever's been happening on the ground and of the advice that Putin is getting. Of course, they won't criticize him directly, but still that's very unusual for Russian state media. Look, I wouldn't be surprised at all if they do some sort of a raise of additional troops. But I think the reality is that the Russian military is spent, it's exhausted, it's corrupt. And their military capabilities on the armament side would take years to replenish. And the support they're getting right now is from Iran and North Korea. I don't think I need to tell you that if you're getting military supplies from North Korea, you are scraping about the bottom of the barrel. I mean, you're getting wood chips at this point.
So just quickly, because we're out of time, but just both of you, starting with you, Roland. I mean, is this a tipping point in this conflict with the gains Ukraine has made, with the changing public language or stances? I mean, are we nearing a tipping point in this conflict?
I think that the trends are not looking good for Russia right now, for sure. Tipping point, I don't know. There have been so many unpredictable developments. I don't want to be overemphasize the significance of the present moment. That's the broad trend, though.
Right. So, Ian Bremmer, maybe it's an unfair question, but I'm hoping you can give us your thoughts on it.
The tipping point is for Russia, not for Ukraine. The tipping point is that Russia has been decoupled from the G7 advanced industrial economies. That's never happened to a G20 economy before. It, of course, reflects a win for the United States, Canada, and its allies in unifying to make that happen. But it also is a danger because the likelihood that the Russians will lash out as a rogue in the corner over time goes well beyond Ukraine.
Okay, listen, thank you both. It's always great to have you on. Ian Bremmer, Roland Paris, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.